of careful thought, I've decided the right thing for the Bureau is for me to serve until the end of the current administration in January and then step down.
Of the 13 heroes that we lost at Abbey Gate, and I deeply regret that we did not do more and could not do more.
No member of Congress should be accosted or assaulted or attacked based on their political beliefs.
Hello, I'm Caitlin Huey-Burns in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. FBI Director Christopher Wray announced today that he's stepping down. Wray says he'll resign before incoming President Donald Trump takes office. Trump has said he'll nominate loyalist Kash Patel as FBI Director. Here was Patel shortly after the news broke.
We look forward to a very smooth transition at the FBI, and I'll be ready to go on day one.
Patel and several high-profile picks for jobs in Trump's new administration were back here in Washington today. Pete Hegseth, Tulsi Gabbard, and Kristi Noem were also meeting with senators on Capitol Hill. And we'll start tonight with Ed O'Keefe and Scott McFarlane. Scott is on Capitol Hill, and Ed, I believe, is in New York covering the president-elect. Scott, I want to start with you on the Hill. We kind of expected some kind of announcement from Wray, given that Trump had already announced his plans to nominate Kash Patel to this position. But tell us a little bit about why Wray announced this today.
Yeah, this has been something he'd been considering for some time, according to sources speaking with CBS News. Had been wrestling with for a while, trying to get a measure as to whether this was a good idea to do proactively or preemptively to a degree. In his statement to his employees in a very crowded room at FBI headquarters down the street, he said he did this to avoid dragging the agency through what's about to happen, through the political arguments that seem inevitable when Trump takes over when it comes to the relationship between the White House, the Department of Justice, and its law enforcement arm. But Christopher Wray's statement doesn't come as a shock here. I mean, there was an anticipation this was inevitable after Trump went ahead and nominated somebody to replace him, to fill a job that wasn't vacant. And as Kash Patel walked through here a short while ago, moments after Wray's announcement, he said, very similar to what you heard in that clip, that he's focused and will be ready on day one. I can tell you right now, Wray's announcement that he will resign does disarm Democrats of one of the arguments they've been using against Patel, that you can't be applying for a job and interviewing for a job that isn't open. Now it is. The berth is wider for Kash Patel.
And Ed, to you, you've been covering the transition here. Kash Patel has been meeting with senators. What's been the reaction to him? Does this seem like a Senate willing to confirm him?
Well, they're at least reserving judgment for now, but being somewhat supportive of his pick. We've heard a handful of senators do the, well, you know, as long as nothing else shows up in his record in the next several weeks, I guess I'm with him. But not as necessarily, huge outpouring of explicit support. There are obviously those that are most loyal to the president-elect and who believe generally that a president should get to have whoever it is he wants, absent some really egregious reason not to. But as they make their way through the Judiciary Committee and some other related committees, so far at least, senators have said that they're on board with him. And so we'll see if there is any other reservations about this. But, I think the other thing to keep in mind with all of this, Caitlin, is, in essence, Wray now is the biggest political casualty of the transition and of the forthcoming administration. While it was telegraphed really since Trump's failed re-election attempt back in 2020 that he might do this, certainly the fate was sealed earlier this month when he announced Kash Patel as his for his preference to lead the FBI. That was certainly a big signal as well. It's just a reminder that he is on a mission to clear out people like Wray who have wronged him in one way or another, and who, to his mind and to the mind of those he's nominating to some of these positions, reflect that sort of deep state mentality that he believes he's been elected to erase.
Right, and worth noting, too, that Trump was the one who appointed Wray in the first place. Scott, I want to switch gears a little bit because I know you've been on the Hill following this alleged assault against Congresswoman Nancy Mace. What happened and what are you hearing?
Yeah, a few important morsels of news to unpack as the day ended here in Washington. First of all, Congresswoman Mace of South Carolina alleges she was physically assaulted for political reasons while here beneath the protective dome of the Capitol complex by somebody who got past the metal detectors without any weapons, but who accosted her. You see her there with her arm in a sling. She says she injured the top of her arm, the wrist area in this assault. The Capitol Police Chief, testifying in an unrelated hearing late today, made a couple other revelations that these types of threats against lawmakers are increasing by orders of magnitude. In the past month, according to the Capitol Police Chief's testimony, more than 50 members of Congress have been swatting victims, the victims of swatting attacks, where somebody targets a public figure by alleging falsely there's some type of mass shooting or emergency at said person's home. The SWAT team deploys, and that can get very dangerous if there's a miscommunication when the SWAT team thinks there's a mass shooting at your home. That's one nugget. The other nugget from the Capitol Police Chief is that there have been 700-plus threat investigations involving members of Congress in just the past few weeks. It's actually a pretty consistent clip over this year. But he said they only have about 20 threat investigation agents, and that they are undermanned. And at this point need wildly more resources and manpower to keep up with the threat environment in this distinctively toxic political moment.
And with lawmakers being kind of the most accessible to the public, that is important to keep an eye on. Ed, I want to kind of stay in the Capitol because I know you've done a lot of reporting on Pete Hegseth. He is Trump's pick for defense secretary, of course. Today, he met with moderate Republican Susan Collins, who will be a key vote here. She had this to say after that meeting. Let's take a listen.
I obviously always wait until we have an FBI background check, and one is underway in the case of Mr. Hegseth. And I wait to see the committee hearing before reaching a final decision.
So, Ed, it seems like Hegseth is in a much better position than he was about a week ago. What exactly happened? What happened to kind of make him have some, at least for now, some staying power?
Well, again, I think he's being given, a lease on life that runs until his confirmation hearing, at least, by having all these Republican senators not say that they're outright opposed to him, not say that there's something specific in his record that gives them pause. But as you see Susan Collins there saying, I'll wait and look at the paperwork and I'll listen to the hearing. And yes, this is what she does. And she likes to drag it out. And eventually there'll probably be some dramatic floor speech where she announces her decision. And given that she's a Republican and she's facing re-election in a few years, that's going to be a factor in her decision. I think the one thing to watch throughout all of this, and there's been some other reporting on this elsewhere in the last few days, because it's been pretty apparent that it's the women of the Republican conference in the Senate who are the ones sort of expressing the most skepticism or concern about the allegations that were made against Hegseth and about his qualifications. We saw the Joni Ernst statement earlier this week or in recent days saying that, based on our conversation and the fact that he is committed to curbing sexual assault in the ranks and supports the idea of women remaining in combat, I look forward to watching the process play out. That is not a yes. That's a let him keep going. Susan Collins doing the same today. Lisa Murkowski has said something similar. But if any or all of those women start to break against him, it would be mathematically impossible and politically really difficult for Republicans to confirm him. So they're going to be a block to watch.
Yeah, indeed. Important context there. Scott, we're also following on Capitol Hill, a busy day up there. Secretary of State Blinken was there to offer testimony about the Afghanistan withdrawal. Let's play a little bit of his testimony.
Even the U.S. government's most pessimistic assessments did not anticipate that the Afghan government and security forces would collapse so rapidly in the face of Taliban advances. In the 3 years since the end of our country's longest war, all of us, including myself, have wrestled with what we could have done differently during that period and over the preceding 2 decades.
All right, Scott, that withdrawal happened 3 years ago. Why is Blinken on the Hill today, and what happened at this hearing?
Now, the Secretary and House Republicans battled for months over this testimony. Republicans threatened at one point to hold him in contempt of Congress and did for not answering them more promptly. The bottom line is this. This ends up where it's been over the past few months, with the Secretary saying the administration was jammed here, painted in a corner by then-President Trump for setting an artificial deadline and a public deadline for withdrawal. The Republicans saying the administration wildly mismanaged this. They campaigned on that. And to a degree, they campaigned very successfully on that failure.
They did indeed. Well, Ed and Scott, Thank you for covering this transition from all angles today. We appreciate your reporting. And inflation is not as high as it was a few years ago, but the latest Consumer Price Index report shows the Federal Reserve's fight to push it down has not yet reached its end. Those numbers are next. You're watching America Decides. According to a new inflation report, consumer prices ticked up in November compared to October. It's the latest sign that inflation remains a persistent issue for people across this country. The new rise coincides with another cost of goods concern for Americans. Grocery giant Albertsons called off its nearly $25 billion merger with Kroger after a federal judge temporarily blocked the union in an effort to protect consumers from increasing costs yesterday. Albertsons is also now suing the rival grocery chain, claiming Kroger willfully breached the merger agreement. In response, a spokesperson for Kroger told CBS News, quote, Albertsons' claims are baseless and without merit. CBS News Money Watch correspondent Kelly O'Grady joins us now to break this all down. Kelly, good to see you. I'm glad you're here. What grounds exactly is Albertsons suing Kroger over?
Well, it's good to be with you, Caitlin. And this is really about breach of contract. So Albertsons is saying that Kroger did not fulfill the agreement to merge and that, in fact, they stood in the way of this happening. They're saying that they didn't do enough to convince the judge that this was a good merger, that they've spent hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, of course, Kroger is saying, well, that's certainly not the case. We did everything that we possibly could. We wanted this to go through. Any company can sue anyone, so it's really where this will go. But right now it's about breach of contract.
I do want to talk about today's Consumer Price Index because it shows inflation rose at a faster annual and monthly rate in November compared to October. So we're all wondering, and you've been reporting a lot on this, kind of how all of this will affect the Federal Reserve's meeting next week. What should we expect?
So we should expect a quarter-point cut still, and the markets are absolutely pricing that in. But this does raise the question of, hey, we are seeing the fight against inflation kind of hit a wall here. We're seeing this. It's not just an anomaly. It's not just 1 month. We've now had 2 months where inflation is rising. And Caitlin, when you dig into the numbers, it's rising because of food prices, shelter prices. These are necessities. You can't just say, well, I'll eat next month. So it's certainly going to spark a discussion for the Fed of, hey, we have a strong job market. We're seeing inflation start to tick back up. Should we pause? I will say that's unlikely to happen because the investors want the rate cut. They've priced it in, and the Fed doesn't want to disappoint them.
Yeah, that's an important point there because that's how people, measure their personal economy is the price of food, something that they obviously need. In other news today, the NASDAQ hit 20,000 for the first time ever today. Can you give us some context about what exactly that means? And does this CPI report have anything to do with it?
So it's definitely because of the CPI report, because there is the expectation, because the numbers came in line with expectations. The expectation was it was going to tick up. But that expectations line is important because what investors see is a rate cut means very good things for tech stocks. The NASDAQ is a very tech-heavy index. And when you get a rate cut, the cost to borrow money goes down. That means all your tech companies that invest in AI, they can pour more money at a cheaper cost. And that's why you're seeing the markets rise, because that cut is expected.
All right, we will keep an eye on that, as you will too. Kelly O'Grady, thank you so much. And you can keep track of the cost of just about everything from checking out the CBS News Money Watch price tracker at cbsnews.com/prices. And North Carolina's Republican legislature overrides the Democratic governor's veto on hurricane disaster relief. Legislation that includes controversial election provisions. Next, the legislation that Governor Roy Cooper is calling a sham. You're watching America Decides.
Now it's the governor's turn to govern, and the Republicans think they can take it away at the last minute. It seems unconstitutional to me.
It's a slap in the face to all the people who have been affected by Hurricane Helene.
Those were protesters outside North Carolina's state capitol expressing their outrage over the Hurricane Helene disaster relief bill that contains several controversial election provisions. Today, the state's legislature overrode Governor Roy Cooper's veto on the bill. State Board of Elections Executive Director Karen Brinson-Bell has said that the bill, quote, may make it impossible for the county boards of elections to adequately ensure every eligible ballot cast is counted, especially in high turnout elections. And David Becker is with us now. He's a CBS News election law expert and is the executive director for the Center for Election Innovation and Research. David, good to see you. Thanks for being here. So let's talk through this. Can you kind of walk us through what kind of impact this will have on voting access in North Carolina?
Yeah, so first of all, this is a very radical change in how North Carolina runs its elections, putting the election board under the authority of the state auditor. That would be the only state in the country that gives the state auditor that authority. To my knowledge, it might be the only state in the history of the United States that had given the state auditor that authority. The state auditor is the only Republican elected statewide when people went to vote for him in North Carolina this past November, just a few weeks ago. Nobody had any idea this office would have any authority over elections. If this individual, the state auditor, has authority over the state board, we could see a radical restructuring of the state board, of the 100 county boards. It could result in changing of staff. And this is particularly remarkable when we think about the success North Carolina just had. North Carolina ran an outstanding election with remarkable challenges that they overcame. We remember the hurricane and the chaos that created in several western counties. Those election officials in those western counties in North Carolina did a remarkable job. And they've had several really close elections. And the results of those elections have withstood the scrutiny that has been applied to them, even in the face of challengers trying to ask for recounts and challenging voters. So we've seen the North Carolina election system perform remarkably well, and this would potentially throw chaos into the mix.
And you alluded to this, but the state board has raised some major concerns. How difficult will it be to make it, how difficult will this be to count ballots?
Well, it's changed some of the rules around how those ballots are counted, how long voters have to, for instance, cure a ballot that might have an administrative flaw on the outside of the envelope if it's a mail ballot. It shrinks the amount of time that voters have and election officials have to fix ballots that might need some fixing. In other words, there is a date missing or a signature was missing or couldn't be matched for some reason, from 7 days down to 2.5. So we're shrinking that by about 2/3 that amount of time, and there's apparently no additional resources. So you're going to see election officials having to do the same amount of work in 1/3 of the amount of time, which is going to be a tremendous challenge for them, again, after they just saw so much success in the 2024 cycle.
And what was kind of the motivation behind this bill?
So it's hard to assess what the exact motivation is, but this bill was not an elections bill. We're in the lame duck session right now, where the Republican supermajority that can theoretically override a veto of the Democratic governor, that's about to go away in the next session. And this bill was supposed to be a hurricane relief bill. And what the governor has said, and what many others who have experienced the damage from the hurricane have said, is this bill in the first place didn't provide enough relief. The governor asked for nearly 5 times as much money as was in this bill to help those who have suffered as a result of the hurricanes. And I think that's one of the reasons he vetoed it. But instead, they've stuck this radical restructuring of the North Carolina election system into this bill, presumably because they know they couldn't get it done in a regular session next year when they no longer have the supermajorities. And they've given it to the only Republican statewide officer in the state, rather than giving it, for instance, to the Secretary of State of North Carolina, which is one of the few states where the Secretary of State has no election authority. But that happens to be a Democrat in the state of North Carolina. So that they decided apparently not to do that. So it looks like this is kind of a last-minute power grab by a supermajority in the supermajority of Republicans in the state legislature, rather than focusing on what apparently the bill was supposed to be, which was a hurricane relief bill.
And is there any kind of mechanism that you could challenge this legislation?
Well, I'm sure there will be some court cases. The Supreme Court in North Carolina is controlled right now by a Republican majority. Unclear whether or not that would they would uphold that. I'm unclear whether or not there's something that could violate North Carolina state law in this bill. It should be noted that one of those very close races I mentioned was a North Carolina state Supreme Court race where the Democrat won by just over 700 votes over the Republican candidate. The Republicans would still be a majority regardless of the outcome of that race on the North Carolina Supreme Court.
All right, we will keep an eye on all of this, as I know you will too. David Becker, thank you so much.
Thanks, Kayla.
And another Trump family friend has been tapped for an administration role. Next, more on where Kimberly Guilfoyle is expected to land. You're watching America Decides.
Ladies and gentlemen, leaders and fighters for freedom and liberty and the American dream, the best is yet to come.
All right, it's kind of hard to forget that moment from Kimberly Guilfoyle at the 2020 Republican National Convention. And while several reports say that her relationship with Donald Trump Jr. may be a thing of the past, the president-elect has tapped her to serve as the ambassador to Greece. Let's bring in our political panel, Megan Hayes and Lance Trover. Megan previously served as the director of message planning for the Biden White House, and Lance is a Republican strategist who served as a spokesperson for North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum's White House bid. Great to see you both. So we remember that moment from the convention. Greece, not a bad place to be, but the idea that Trump has appointed a lot of family members to his cabinet, the fathers of his daughters-in-law and other family members, not to the cabinet, I should say, to places in the administration. Lance, I'm wondering, what does this say about how Trump may govern? And do you think Americans care that he's putting family members in these positions?
I don't think they give two. Oh, we're on a family show. Family program. I don't think they care at all. Kimberly Guilfoyle is an attorney by trade. She was an associate prosecutor in San Francisco. I mean, she has a career of her own. And yeah, he's done that. He did that in the last administration where we saw his daughter and son-in-law in the White House. And I don't think anybody really cared then. I'm not sure a lot of people care now. I think it's important for the president to have people around him that he trusts and the people that he can turn to. And if it's members of his family, and I'm actually okay with it. And I don't think the voters are really minded that much.
I mean, is there anything to that, Megan? I mean, obviously we know that Biden pardoned his own son, but is there anything to that? Do you think that it could help him?
So I agree with you. I don't actually think people care that are out in the general public. I also think there's not much difference in appointing your father-in-law, your daughter's father-in-law, or your son's ex-fiance here in Greece. These are political appointments. The ambassadorships are very political, and so these all serve a different purpose. And also these positions are much more diplomatic and much more of a relationship building. They sponsor a lot of parties and are very, representing America in a different social way than actually governing. So these ambassador posts, I think, are fine. If you start getting into positions in the government, I think that's a different conversation.
Yeah, that's an important nuance there and distinction there. I do want to talk about Kash Patel because today we have big news, obviously, that FBI Director Wray says he's going to resign. I mean, no big surprise here because Trump had said that he was going to appoint Patel. The reaction on Capitol Hill seems pretty supportive, at least among Republicans at this point. How should they be navigating all of this? And what do they make of Wray's announcement today?
To me, it's not a surprise. I mean, it was coming one way or the other. Look, I think Kash Patel is going to get through the Senate. I think Pam Bondi's going to get through the Senate. In fact, I think most of everybody else going forward are probably going to get through the Senate. They laid down the marker on one with Matt Gaetz. I've argued for a long time now. I think those number of chits with the Senate are limited out there. And so I think you've seen the reaction, particularly among the grassroots in Republicans out there who are really getting behind the Pete Hegseth of the world, who are getting behind the Kash Patels of the world. You're seeing the Trump organization come out strongly in favor of them. And so that's going to put a lot of pressure on these senators, particularly the ones that are up for re-election in 2026. They have to think long and hard about, do I really want to cross President Trump and the grassroots on this stuff?
And it's interesting because obviously a lot of the focus has been on the Republicans. They are going to have the majority in the Senate when it comes to these confirmations. They're in the spotlight. But Democrats seem, I don't know if it's just that the spotlight has been on Republicans, but Democrats do seem a little bit muted in their criticisms. Are they just waiting for the confirmation hearings to kind of put forward a more robust opposition, or are they kind of ceding the spotlight? How should Democrats navigate this?
I think that they are waiting for the confirmation hearings, right? They don't have a lot to do here. I think that a lot of this is coming out into the public. It's going through the media, and the narrative is being driven publicly that they don't have to be saying a lot. So this is on the Republicans right now to even consider if we do have another Gates situation with Hegseth or Tulsi Gabbard or even Kash Patel, if they're going to not even get to an actual hearing. So I think that Democrats will get all this stuff, are waiting for all this stuff to come out in the public eye, and then when it comes to the hearings, they will start asking really tough questions, and it will be tough for them, and they will put them on the spot. But I don't think that they need to be doing anything right now, because right now is not the time for them to do it. So Republicans need to make sure that these folks get to a hearing.
And Lance, to your point, and kind of to that point as well, I mean, this pressure campaign that you mentioned, it seemed like that was out in full force, especially on Hegseth. Yeah. What's kind of the Republican thinking? Is it that, Republicans owe their seats to Donald Trump? They have an important role to play here, and advice and consent is a top job for them. What is it about this pressure campaign that you think is working?
I think it's just a reminder to the senators that this, Donald Trump won, and he won pretty resoundingly. And, I don't know that people owe their seats to him necessarily. I think there are a lot of members of Congress who do owe their seats to Donald Trump, very much so, and should not forget that. But the grassroots are important to the entire Trump operation. MAGA world is very important. And, for some of these folks who are up in 2026, they could potentially face primaries. And that's what they need to think about when they go into whether they want to cross or not. Yes, they absolutely have an advising consent. They should absolutely do that and ask the tough questions. You saw Senator Collins today met with Pete Hegseth. She's like, look, I asked him some tough questions. That's what they're doing. That's all part of the process. I think where Republicans were getting a little annoyed was this trying to, I don't want to attack the media, but I mean, the media going pretty hard at some of these folks. And I think they've just felt the need that there needed to be some pushback saying, no, we're with the president and we're with his appointments.
And also with Joni Ernst in particular, who is getting bracketed pretty heavily with ads in Iowa, and her 2026 campaign looked a little untenable with a primary candidate coming. It was also floated that she wanted to be the DOD to replace him, and I think it put her in a really tough spot not to go with Hegseth now, because now it's like, do you face a primary candidate? Do you get the DOD appointment? That kind of put her in a really tough political spot. So this is politics, I think, at its best, and they have to understand that Trump is the leader of their party, and this is the price you're paying for having him as the leader of your party. Yeah, and something that these lawmakers have had to navigate for a while is that these are their constituents too, that they are representing, to your point, members of the MAGA base. What I'm also interested in is kind of where Democrats are. We've all been talking about that for a while, but is there a leader that's kind of emerging in the Democratic Party, or anybody that we should keep an eye on? Because I was kind of thinking about this with Biden's speech yesterday on the economy. He really hasn't been out there. I mean, we're in a transition process. He only has about 6 weeks to go still in office. But there are big questions about who is emerging as a leader of the Democratic Party. I mean, is there anyone that you have an eye on, or anybody that you may be looking for in these confirmation hearings, for example, to kind of see where Democrats go? I think it'll be interesting to see, but I think that the governors are really going to play a role in the Democratic Party moving forward, because I think that, as we saw, that the Midwest and the country is much more moderate, and Democrats are going to have to move to the middle, and the Midwest governors are really the ones who are leading the charge on that. So I think that will be interesting to watch. In terms of the Senate hearings, I think it will be interesting to see what, for instance, Senator Gillibrand does with Pete Hegseth. I mean, sexual assault in the military is one of her top issues. So it'll be interesting to sort of see how these people come out and they stake their ground in some of these issue areas. But I think we'll have to wait until Trump is actually inaugurated and these hearings go forth to see who's going to be a new rising star. Yeah, sometimes they emerge from these kinds of hearings. We'll see. A lot more to discuss, so we'll have you guys back very soon. Megan and Lance, thank you very much for your time. Thank you. And tonight, we remember Bill Hennessy. You may not recognize his name, but he had a front row seat to history. Hennessy went where cameras were often allowed not to go, chronicling some of the most storied courtroom dramas in modern history. Just this year alone, he drew the scene for Trump's immunity decision at the Supreme Court and his election interference case. Bill Hennessy passed away yesterday on his birthday at 67. And deporting millions of undocumented immigrants, throwing out birthright citizenship, but also protecting dreamers, Texas Republican Congressman Chip Roy joins us next to discuss President-elect Donald Trump's immigration plans. You're watching America Decides.
Yes, we're going to do something about the dreamers.
What does that mean? What are you going to do?
I will work with the Democrats on a plan, and if we can come up with a plan, but the Democrats have made it very, very difficult to do anything.
President-elect Trump says he wants a deal to protect dreamers. These are undocumented immigrants brought into the country as children, and that's despite his plans to conduct mass deportations when he takes office next month. Texas Republican Congressman Chip Roy joins us now from Capitol Hill. Congressman, good to see you. Thanks for being here. So, do you agree with President-elect Trump talking about protections or wanting protections for dreamers? Is that something you would support?
Well, President Trump's well within his rights to, talk about ways in which he's going to try to figure out how to navigate all this to do what he said to the American people he would do, which is secure the border of the United States and deal with the absolute disaster that President Biden and his administration left the American people. 5.5 million people have been dumped into the United States with the abuse and misuse of parole authority and asylum authority. Americans have died from Laken Riley to, my friend Alexis Nuggery's beautiful daughter, Jocelyn Nuggery in Houston, all at the hands of people who were released by this administration into the country. We've got to end it. President Trump is looking for the resources, and the House and the Senate ought to grant him those resources to begin removing these people, secure the border of the United States, and then we can have a conversation about what to do going forward.
But when it comes to dreamers specifically, is that something that you want to see protections for?
I mean, our job right now is to secure the border, is to manage the fact that we've got all of these people that have been released into the United States, including criminals. We have 1.4 million people who have orders of removal, including, by the way, they issued a list today from ICE. You had 37,000 Chinese nationals, 1,700 from Afghanistan on this list of people who have been ordered to be removed from our country, and Biden won't do it. So the first thing we're going to do is secure the border. Tom Homan's going to do that work. We're going to remove people. We'll have a conversation then about what we do, but we need policy reforms too. If we're going to have any conversations about this, we need H.R. 2's core elements to fix asylum, fix parole, fix the unaccompanied children, fix the fact that we have catch and release, and do what we need to do to have policy changes to ensure in the future no president can ever abuse our country like Joe Biden did over the last 4 years.
And Congressman, you're from a border state, obviously, and you've been very vocal about the need for the Department of Homeland Security to preserve records about the border for the incoming Trump team. But I'm wondering, have you seen any evidence that the Biden administration isn't doing this?
Well, it'd be impossible for me to know, wouldn't it? I mean, that's why you issue preservation requests. I'm a former prosecutor. I mean, these are the kinds of things you do when you want to make sure that you've got all of the information so we can assess. And Congress has a duty with oversight to assess what happened here. What did the administration know when they were releasing people to the United States? What did they know about the backgrounds of individuals? When we know Venezuelan prisons were being unloaded and we have criminals coming here and Americans died as a result, there's potential criminal activity if you have people who knowingly released dangerous individuals who were murderers into the United States. We had somebody, by the way, who was alleged to have killed 20 people in his home country who we found in New York who had been released into Texas. This is the kind of thing we need to track, we need to follow, we need oversight, so they need to preserve those records.
And Congressman, President-elect Trump also said that he wants to do away with birthright citizenship. As you well know, this is part of the Constitution. How are you kind of taking that comment? Is that something that Congress could even entertain?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the president is absolutely correct. We've had this as being a problem for a long time. In fact, a federal judge in Texas just had to deal with a case in which a mother was trying to piggyback citizenship onto the child, which we have evidence that she knowingly came across the border to have the baby in El Paso, to get so-called birthright citizenship, and then use that to try to get citizenship herself. The judge thankfully said, no, that's not how this works. But we need to end that practice. We have a whole cottage industry in China, Mexico, all over the world, with people coming here to have babies to get citizenship. You should have to be the child of American citizens to get citizenship by being born. And then if otherwise naturalize. I think we need to make sure that's the law going forward, so it can't be abused as it has been over these many years.
But wouldn't that require amending the Constitution?
Well, that is a question that some people have posited that you would have to amend the Constitution. I don't read the 14th Amendment to demand that you'd have to amend the Constitution that way. I think we could do that through law. But, look, we should move forward, do it by law. And if we need to amend the Constitution, amend the Constitution. But my personal belief is you can do it by law. I believe that's the appropriate standard, that you be a child of an American citizen and that it not just be that you can be literally driven across the Rio Grande, have a baby, and suddenly get so-called birthright citizenship. I think that's a mistake, and most Americans think that's bad policy.
And Congressman, just quickly, we are up against a deadline for funding the government. Are you confident that the government will remain open, that you will reach a deal?
Well, look, the most important question is that we be able to contain spending. And I think that, the Speaker has been trying to work and negotiate with our Democratic colleagues on the other side of the building in the Senate. I think we're probably going to end up with some sort of a continuing resolution into March, which I normally don't love, but I think kicking this into President Trump's leadership and administration makes some sense so we can try to get real actual spending cuts and restraints come March. I hope we can. I think a disaster supplemental might ride along with it. I think that should be paid for. The Speaker, I think, is working hard to try to shrink it, but I think it should be paid for. There'll be some disagreement. I won't be able to vote for a bill like that that's unpaid for, but good chance that it moves next week, but we'll see what happens.
All right, we will see what happens indeed. Congressman Chip Roy, thank you so much for your time. And meanwhile, in Syria, celebrations continue as questions swirl about what the post-Assad era will look like. CBS News foreign correspondent Imtiaz Tayyab is in Syria for us tonight. Imtiaz?
Well, it's been extraordinary to be here in Syria after so many years in which Western journalists simply could not enter, could not see the places that we've seen really in the last 24 hours or so. We were in Aleppo this morning, which up until 2 weeks ago was regime held, which meant Bashar al-Assad and his forces were in control. That, of course, fell to rebel groups, the rebel group known as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And we're now here in Idlib, where Hayat Tahrir al-Sham has been in control for a number of years. Now, HTS is considered a terrorist organization by the United Nations, by the US, and other Western powers. But they've now ousted Bashar al-Assad. They're now in control of Damascus, and global powers are really trying to figure out how they work with HTS. Do they change this designation? Do they formally recognize that? All of this will become clear in the days, weeks, and even months ahead. But the reason we're here in Idlib is we wanted to understand what life was like under HTS. And the people who we spoke to in this admittedly conservative part of Syria had one clear message to all of this, to all of us rather, which was this. HTS will protect the rights of minorities. In a country that was so riven by divisions, particularly when it came to the issue of minorities, that is certainly something many Syrians, including the many millions of Syrians living as refugees abroad, want to hear. Back to you.
President-elect Trump repeatedly pledged to roll back rights for transgender people during his campaign. Next, how those Americans are preparing for his incoming administration. You're watching America Decides. And welcome back to America Decides. In the wake of President-elect Donald Trump's victory, an article in the 19th says that many transgender Americans feel the country elected, quote, a man set on wiping them off the face of the earth. Our CBS News exit polls found that LGBT voters overwhelmingly voted for Vice President Kamala Harris in the 2024 election. According to the article's writer, those intent on protecting the rights of transgender Americans are also more prepared now than ever before for Trump's incoming administration. And the author of that article, Kate Sosin, joins us now. Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it. Before we get into your article, I want to first ask you about this Hennessy case that's currently before the Supreme Court and that we heard arguments from last week. And in those arguments, justices appeared to be sympathetic to the state lawmakers there and their efforts to ban access to gender-affirming care for minors in that state. How concerned, from your reporting, are transgender Americans about this case in particular?
Yeah, trans people are really concerned, not just about this case, which would be landmark for trans people in terms of access to gender-affirming care, but also because the incoming Trump administration has said that they want to ban access to gender-affirming care. And so we're looking at sort of this two-pronged approach. wherein come January, we don't know what the situation will be in terms of accessing things like hormones and surgery for trans people. And there's a lot of fear right now in the community about what it's going to look like in just a couple of months for trans people. And so we have these huge questions about what is our right as trans people in order to access the care that doctors have been recommending for years and years and years in order to treat gender dysphoria.
And talking a little more about that, in this article that you write that advocates said that it's difficult to anticipate how healthcare policy will play out, but whatever happens is not likely to happen immediately. Talk to us a little bit about kind of what that means.
Yeah, so there's a lot of legal questions about how an administration would do this, right? So the administration has said that it would cut off funding to health facilities that provide gender-affirming care to trans people and to transgender minors. The question about this is, will those health centers comply with this? And then also, can the administration legally do that, and how? What levers does it have? So these are huge questions, and also it requires a massive amount of reach that we're just not sure that the federal government has in order to pull this kind of thing off. So, and the same is true of immigration, right? So anytime that you want to track everybody's prescription, you need to have all of these legal levers and eyes on these prescriptions. We just don't know, and we're not confident that the administration would be able to do that. And we're going to need to see this play out in courts across the country, because there are laws that protect transgender people. We have the 2020 Bostock ruling, which is a Supreme Court ruling that found that transgender people are protected by the same laws that protect, for example, cisgender women from gender discrimination. And so we're just not confident that it's going to be so easy for the Trump administration to come in and take away all of these rights from day one. We're going to have to watch it play out. And we saw that with the first Trump administration. A lot of these moves got caught up in the courts for years and years.
Yeah, that's a really interesting context there, and kind of important to point out ahead of the administration. One thing that has happened after the election is that a transgender bathroom ban was implemented on Capitol Hill, but also in the state of Ohio, signed by the governor there. It was recently rejected in Montana's state capital, but I'm wondering, from your reporting on these policies, what has been the reaction? Is there a feeling that more of these kinds of laws will be passed in states?
You know, it's interesting. We've seen just a groundswell of these anti-transgender laws over the past 4 years, and they have been successful. But we've also seen increasingly, especially over the last year, that they've started to fail, and largely because they're untenable. They're intended essentially to drive transgender people out of public life. But the truth is, the transgender people are going to exist one way or another. This is not a problem that can be solved, right? Transgender people are people, they exist. We are being elected to public office. We are part of people's families, friend circles. And this is, you know, it's not a problem with a solution. It's just a fact of our lives. And the more that the American public knows transgender people, the less of an appetite they have for policies that are just inhumane, whether it's pushing people out of bathrooms or denying them their health care. And so I think that increasingly we're going to find that these kinds of laws just cannot stand because they don't have a place or a purpose other than to exclude people from public life.
Yeah, well, Kate Sossin, we appreciate your time and your reporting, and we will keep following as this new administration begins. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
And that does it for us today. We'll be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report starts right now.